welcome to the June episode of Silver Linings Talk Show. Today we are blessed to have Leslie Palumbo. She is a grief counselor, coach, author, and Reiki Master. She guides people who have lost loved ones toward joy again. And some people may think, joy, how do you get there, right? Well, we're going to talk about that. By changing the conversation around grief to include inspiration and empowerment.
I love that.
Love those words.
Love that.
To live the lives their loved ones would be proud of. That makes me feel good.
That makes me tearful.
I know, right?
That's a beautiful
I know,
statement.
I think of my dad right there.
Me too.
Her speaking and writing focuses on the wisdom of grief and unexpected gifts and insight that come with this human experience. Welcome, Leslie. We are so thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, we are so. I feel like this conversation is one everybody can relate to, everybody can understand, and it affects people differently. And I think this is a very important conversation for us to have today with you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And certainly one of our first thoughts that we had was certainly what influenced you to be on a journey of helping people through grief?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess it kind of found me,
Yeah.
I will say. I think, I'm in a helping profession in the field of psychology, and I think most people who are in that field are, interested in helping people find light from the darkness. So that was really my general, kind of direction. And then I had the opportunity to do an internship in graduate school in the Chicago Public Schools. And I worked with young kids in grief. And these were kids who were seeing complicated crisis type of grief pretty much every day. They were dealing with loss, they were dealing with violent grief, violent loss. They were, brothers, sisters, there was gang violence, there was people coming into the school fighting over, like there were people bringing weapons to school, it was an environment of extreme violence and great loss. And the thing that was so astounding that I felt as a young woman was that these kids had such an inherent sense of resilience. Like they had an ability to bounce back that I was like, what is it? What makes that happen? How is that possible? How is it possible that they can still see the beauty and the beauty amidst all of that pain? So I became really kind of fascinated by the study of grief, basically, and what could be learned from those kids. And then I focused on grief, and then in my own life, as it does for all of us, grief found me. Personally, I got that kind of phone call that everybody doesn't want to get, that we all worry we're going to get, and I got it on this beautiful Indian summer morning. And I was told that my mother, who everyone described as the woman who had everything, she had walked out to the end of a dock on the Virginia shoreline. She had sat herself down in a boathouse, and she had taken her life. So for me, that put me in a state of such shock and a journey of very complicated grieving. So then I learned about, more about personally how it affects, even though I knew professionally how does it affect. So it's been the study of grief, yeah.
So you've kind of talked about some experiences. Are there specific lessons that you've pulled from these experiences?
Yes, so many. But I will say with the kids, it started with the kids, and it made me understand that there is something inherent about grief that actually helps us. And I think kids were closer to it. Like we as adults have more in the way. We have more mind activity, we have more in the way of what the natural process of life is. For the kids, the natural process of life was see all of it. Don't just see the pain, see how beautiful life is amidst the pain. So that also told me that grief had an intelligence to it as a process, that there was something that if we didn't get in the way of it, like kids somehow didn't get in the way of it, they had this resilience. They were able to access that resilience more easily. So that was one of the things, yeah. And then the other thing I learned from the death of my mother was, again, there was something bigger at work that was moving me, you know, through this process, and that was landing me in a better place, and that if I could tune into that, that was sort of key.
Well, I remember you mentioning just specifically about the place and the feeling in that place, right? And was that kind of part of it, like the dock and the...
Yes, right. Well, it struck me from day one how beautiful. Like, it was this beautiful, one of the most beautiful. I was up north when I got the phone call, but it was one of the most beautiful Indian summer mornings. Like, and I was like, how could something so painful exist, and all this beauty around it? How could she have been experiencing such pain and be sitting amidst one of the most beautiful places on earth where she died and not be able to access that? So how do we access the beauty amidst the pain? And I think it takes a lot of courage, but I also think it takes open eyes, you know. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. And first, just, you know, we are sorry to hear about that experience, because even when you said it, there was a kind of movement in my body that, you know, that's a very tough thing to experience and have to kind of navigate through. And thank you for at least sharing that piece, because that is another avenue of loss, is suicide.
Right.
Yeah,
For
complicated loss.
A complicated loss, yes. Many emotions and thoughts come
Yeah, and
into that
loss
one.
is, you know, we feel, and oftentimes it is unfair, right? It may happen through illness. It may happen through somebody losing their way and committing suicide. And so how do we make sense of that unfairness and still be okay with it? And that's really the like central task underneath, you know, processing sadness.
So what helped you through that grieving process?
Yeah, so for myself, when that happened, I had been practicing, there were a couple of things. The first thing is I had been practicing mindfulness. So this idea that of sort of holding awareness in the present moment. Because I think when we're in grief, you know, the past becomes incredibly painful. The future is totally uncertain. And really the only resting place is in the present moment. And I found that to be incredibly helpful, just to keep my attention on the moment in front of me. And it really helped with the overwhelm that comes with grief oftentimes. And the other thing that really helped was nature. Because the process of grief is a psychological healing process. It's part of the immune system. So it has its own intelligence. That's part of the system of natural intelligence. So for me, being in nature it matched the pace and the rhythm of the process I was going through. Like, it wasn't like this linear, hurried world that we live in. Like, okay, we're going here at 12 o'clock and we've got to do this and we've got to do that. That was too fast and kind of stressed me out. But being in nature, it could sort of hold it. And it sort of matched what I was going through. So that was also incredibly helpful. And also, I think, to the sense, as I did that and I found comfort in that, I think having this sense of surrender and trust, like, I can trust this process. You know, there's something happening here that's not all horrible, and I can trust that.
And I think I'd love to mention too, I think you mentioned that when you were with your siblings, you were doing some sort of journaling?
I was.
And they weren't quite in the same
like we
realm
would go,
as you were, right?
Right. We would go down to Virginia where my father was, and we would all be together as a family, and we were just trying to make sense of this senseless event, you know. So I was with my sisters, and I would literally have to write everything down. I think that's where the book came from. But I couldn't stop writing because I just needed to make sense of how the paradoxes that are in grief, that, you know, it can be so solitary of a journey and it can be so interpersonal and so connected, that it could be so painful, but there could be beauty all around it. You know, all of these paradoxes, I wanted to make sense of. So I couldn't stop writing. So they were like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I don't know. I just have to make this notebook. I can't." And then later I sort of tried to make some sense of it.
But I love that, because that kind of leads into the next, like, what are ways people can process grief? And
Right.
you were doing it your way while they were doing it their way, and it's kind of okay to question it, because I think that's what helps lead people to maybe their way.
Yeah, I think we all need to find our grief formula, or our grief medicine. And I always think of it as like, you want to identify 3 things, I always say, that you can do in nature that calm you, that you enjoy. You want to identify 2 people that have your back in this way. Some people, when we're going through grief, it's such a hard thing to talk about. It's not something that we're facile with in this, we're not facile with talking about death, talking about loss. And so everybody handles it a different way. So finding the people who can really hear it and who can help you on that journey is really helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you also had mentioned something about a grief goal.
Yes.
Which I think
Yes.
is
Yes.
something that not a lot of people would have or even
Or
understand.
even think of.
And
Yeah.
everybody would be certainly different.
I think you're so right. Like it's antithetical or something. It just doesn't make sense that you'd be having a goal at this time when everything just feels like overwhelming and you're trying to heal from it. But having a goal is so centering and so helpful and important.
Can you give us an example of a grief goal?
Yes, like you want to make it something that is attached to a feeling that you want to have. Like, how do you want to feel coming through this? How do you want to feel in 2 years? How do you want to look back and see yourself having moved through this event? And how can it be connected to your loved one? So, like for me, for example, when I was grieving my mother, I said, I will find something beautiful in this in this tragedy. I will find, the light in this darkness, so to speak. I will find it. And but other things can be connected to like a lost loved one's character. Like I will have these qualities go on because they represented like the 2 best qualities. Or for example, so like I also lost my husband like 9 years ago to cancer, and he was a person who was extremely like full of life and like maximized life. So part of me said, my purpose, my grief goal, my kind of grief resolution at that time was, okay, I have to find a way to fully engage in life because he would have. And it's honoring him in some way. So sometimes it can be about honoring the person, and sometimes it can just be a purpose of, later it can become a purpose of, I'm going to have, start a charity, and I'm going to educate people about certain things. Obviously for me, it has to do with educating people about grief. That makes me feel like it's connected to and meaningful, and maybe make some kind of sense out of people's loss.
Yeah, I love that, because that's kind of what I did when my sister passed. I said, I'm going to help educate people on, metastatic breast cancer and just spread, because she that was her wish in a way.
Yeah.
And she kind of made that clear, but maybe not so much.
Yeah.
And so I kind of hold that near and dear to my heart and I didn't really think of it as a goal.
Yeah.
But maybe it really is.
beautiful. Yes. That's beautiful.
As honoring. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is true.
That's and in a way, thinking about that is helpful for me when I miss her every day.
Right.
Right?
It's a place to put it.
Yeah.
All,
Yeah.
And it helps ground you, I think. I don't know, but that's a beautiful.
Well, you just made me
way of
think about
honoring.
it by
Yeah.
saying that. And another recognition that you just made me think about is my father had recently passed, and my mother's going through her journey, and she's got little things set up around the house, like she has the rings set together, and she goes, sometimes I'll put his ring on if my fingers are swollen and just wear it for the day. And she's set up like his picture, like little like altar kind of things. And I
Yeah.
think that's sweet. And some people might judge that. And I would love to hear what you would tell somebody if they were coming to you and judging somebody for grieving in that manner.
Yeah, I think it's it's amazing how individual it is, right? Because
Yes.
the thing that you could say to somebody, that a thing that you could say to one person to try and help them or support them in their loss might actually not be comforting to them. It might be comforting to me, but it might not be comforting to you, because we all have different ways and different microcultures about how we approach death and loss and grieving. And I always think in terms of, think about the intent of your words that you're saying to somebody that you'd like to comfort, or that you know that you'd like to support. And then as you receive, as the person who's going through grief, try to remember the intent underneath the words, because a lot of times the words aren't perfect. We mess up, we say the wrong thing, it's kind of awkward. Sometimes we say nothing because we're a little nervous. But if we think about somebody's intent, intent is, it can be received kind of energetically underneath the words, and that's really helpful. And then I think of, if you're trying to support somebody, I think you know, the deep, really it's meeting somebody where they are, not where you'd like them to be. Because sometimes we judge people, we say, like, but I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't create an altar. I would, you know, I would be out running and just, you know, not thinking about it. And look, those are both completely valid ways of moving through grief, but they're different. So we can't apply our own thinking to someone else's experience. We just have to try and enter into it and listen. And I always find those people who are so supportive may have never been through it before, but they just know how to, like, really listen and be present to someone else's experience.
And I just think noticing and acknowledging can be helpful to the person, because if you don't, then maybe they could question what they're doing. But just saying, oh, isn't that neat that you're doing this? I think that's special.
Yeah.
Because it's almost just giving them an affirmation or a recognition that, you know, hey, I think you're doing something neat, rather than saying nothing or being critical of it. Like, well, what did you do that for?
Yes.
Right? Because I think, like you said, words are important. And especially during that first few years, that really tender period. Not that anybody should judge what the tender period should be, but I think those words can be very important.
I think it's interesting that you just said the first few years, because this is what was going through my mind, is just to kind of highlight also that there are many times people give support for a few months, because it's fresh in their mind also. It has touched their life in some way. And then we tend to kind of move on with our own life, our own responsibilities, everything going on. And the person who has experienced the loss may feel that they are kind of left. And I think, like, that's super important when we talk about support, is that support shouldn't be just the first 2 or 3 months, is continue to check in, continue to, you know, go and visit, continue to make plans, continue to do anything that benefits that individual to be able to see the light.
Yeah.
Because when everybody leaves, that could make it where someone kind of slips more into darkness.
Yeah, because it's such a solitary experience, because it's individual, it's solitary, and we can feel really isolated when people start to move on. And we're still left in that inner journey.
Absolutely, and that touches on exactly that, you know, what support looks like. It's not linear. It doesn't have a time element on it.
Yeah.
And
it's a lot of, like you said, Lynn, it's a lot of reassurance and validation to say, like, you've got this, you're on the right path, it's going to get better, you're doing great. Like, this is hard.
And you do what you need to do. Because these little things that you do every day in these transition periods are exactly that, are what you need to do. And validating that it's okay, or it's fabulous, or whatever words that you think they need to hear is...
Yeah, and I think people who are going through grief really deserve our honor and respect. And our studiousness, because we will be where they are someday. And every grief is new and every grief is different. So you may think you know, but each time you're going through it for the first time. So a lot of honor and respect, I think, is helpful.
And what are stages of grief?
So, there are the classic stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about, which is kind of, anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are like the 5 ones but there are some things that people don't talk about as much, which I think are incredibly helpful for people to know. Again, the reassurance, like, I'm not crazy, I'm just sad. I'm going through a natural human phase of development, and everybody goes through it at a different time, but this is something we all have to go through, and I believe there's a purpose to it. The purpose is not just to restore from loss. The purpose is actually to expand some of the very best of our human qualities, because we do expand our empathy when we think about someone else in loss. We, empathy, compassion, mercy, grace, wisdom, all these things. So in terms of understanding the phases of grief, the first one that I think everybody goes through is shock. And shock is, occurs with every grief, because it doesn't matter whether we knew it was coming or not. We could never imagine life without the person we loved until it actually happens. We can try, but we can't understand what it's like to not have somebody be on this earth anymore that we were so connected to.
Right.
Yeah.
So the shock comes, and the shock is protective, and it protects us from the enormity of the loss, but it's also very ungrounding. And it also takes a huge amount of energy, and people don't realize, the research shows that shock takes like up to 70% of our physical, mental, and emotional energy in the early phases of grief. And there are different levels of shock that kind of wear off over time. But 70%, that's like walking around with a bad flu, 30% of your energy. Yeah. And so people don't realize how exhausting it is. And when they hear it, they're like, oh, that is why I can't get out of bed, or I feel like I want to sleep all the time, or I can't do all the things I used to be able to do. It's so puzzling. So that's one of the phases that I think is really important to talk about, and that's actually is linear. Grief is so non-linear. It so circles back on itself and goes in waves and all that stuff, but shock is really intense, in the first, several months, and then up to the first 6 months, and then even lasts up to a year. There's a layer that comes off. People talk about the second year and how hard it is. It's because shock kind of ends after the first year, and so each level kind of feels a little harder. But there's also something else that's linear that happens around 6 to 8 months, and this happens so universally, and it's confusing unless you know about it, but it happens around 6 to 8 months, and it's this feeling almost of backsliding. It's a feeling almost of going back to square one, like overwhelm and hypersensitivity. It's like a feeling like, oh my God, wait, I thought I was doing really well. And all of a sudden now, wait, am I not doing well? Am I not handling this well? Can I even handle this? Like, I feel like it's like I felt at the beginning, this is really hard. And there are several reasons for that. One is that shock wears off at a 6-month mark.
That makes
Two
sense.
is just what you said before, Dina, that people start to move on from the loss. Peripheral people can start to move on, and you're still left in this intense internal process. And 3 is you've been at it just long enough, this new territory, this exhausting territory, where you're kind of working every day with sadness and how to fit that into your life, that you're tired. Yeah. So like it all hits at that 6 to 8 month mark. And I've kind of always I've wondered and studied kind of like, why does it get hard if it's supposed to be healing us, right? And I think it's actually because the hard moments kind of propel us forward into the future, and the purpose is to restore us, to be in the world again and be living in the world in joy.
And healing can be hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Healing has stages.
with that, with those stages, I think you had something to show us on tools that can maybe help through these stages of grief.
Yeah, I think there are tools that can help us with all grief, and they're just helpful no matter what. But they're helpful every time we feel those sticking places, those like, oh my God, what's
So we see those
so
up on the screen.
confusing.
We have faith.
Yeah, so the first one is faith, and that is, we can have faith in change, like the nature of life is change, that things will get better, and faith can be, of course, spiritual. it can be religious, and those are beautiful things if you have them. If you don't, it's helpful to try and find some faith in these other things as well, that life will change and things will get better, and faith in ourselves that we can handle this. You know, we can develop and expand faith in ourselves, and then faith in grief as a process of restoration.
And number 2 is probably the hardest one, self-compassion.
Self-compassion is the hardest one, and it's the thing we really learn. I think it's the thing I hear most from clients that they feel they have more of after the loss than before, and they're grateful for, because we have to, you know, be okay with however we feel, and we have to apply the same kind of kindness and compassion that we would to a friend, you know, and a loved one. Like, we would treat often our kids or our loved ones really with a lot more kindness than we treat ourselves, and this is this opportunity to expand that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Number 3.
And number 3 is perspective, and that's seeing things from all angles. I remember when I was at the Grand Canyon and there was a ranger giving a lecture, and he said, human beings have been on Earth one piece of paper in the entire mile depth of the Grand Canyon. In that moment, I was like, my problems aren't, you know, there's more to life than my pain. There's more about life when I look at the sky, you know, so perspective is really, really helpful when we can apply it like that.
We just have a couple of minutes left, so I want to kind of jump into this topic that I think is so important, is moving beyond grief to restoration of joy.
Yeah, grief, really, that is the goal of all grief, is to return of joy. And the return of joy is brought to us by the process of grief, but it's a different kind of joy. So some people say, like, I'll never feel joy again. You won't feel the same kind of joy. We're changed by grief. But the joy that returns is a kind of intimate joy. I mean, excuse me, more intricate joy. It's an intricate joy that has deep knowledge of the opposite of joy, right? And the ephemeral nature of joy and happiness.
And we have your book up, The Wisdom of Grief, and this came out of your initial journalings of just trying to understand your own thoughts and feelings, and then studying it and learning more about it.
Yeah, it did.
Excellent.
Yeah.
How about
Some great information in that book, for sure.
Yes.
Awesome.
How about any final thoughts and how people can reach you? Here we are.
Yeah. So absolutely come find me on thewisdomofgrief.com and any kind of Instagram, but the website has resources for grief and how to move through grief.
Great.
And what's going on, and then my new online course, which is called The Blueprint for Grief, which is literally everything you need to know about every question you ever had about grief. So hopefully it will be helpful to people.
Oh, I think
Wonderful.
so. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh.
What an important topic.
Yes.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
opportunity. Thanks.